Then I was given a measuring rod like a staff, and I was told, "Rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there." Revelation 11:1. Hello, and welcome to my daily walk, the show where a Hollywood guy, that's me, walks around and talks about anything and everything except the things I'm contractually bound to conceal. If you want to lend your voice to the record, I read emails on the Friday. The Friday show is a free-for-all, and I reserve the right to do whatever I want on Fridays. And that includes reading emails. So email me at MyDailyWalk at thiswaytv.com. Quick rundown of what the show is about. If this is your first time listening, My Daily Walk is literally, it's as literal a show name as I can imagine. I do take a walk every day, and I live a life, which is my daily walk. And so I'm just letting you in, giving you a glimpse of what's going on in my head. I work in Hollywood. Well, I am developing a project. I've been working in Hollywood for a little while, and I have a project I'm working on, and it's fun, exciting. I think it's in development, so you don't know about it. It's under wraps. I can't tell you a lot of things about it, but I can tell you some things, and sometimes I do. I let things out. I have I decided, I had an idea, and then I acted upon it to begin journaling, audio journaling for at least a half hour a day. Call it my daily walk, share some thoughts, and sometimes you get glimpses of what I'm working on, but more so you just, I guess, get to hear what's going on in my head and in my heart. And if that's something that interests you, then cool. It was just an idea I acted upon. I have the ability, the technology, and the desire. And here we go. Mondays are a meditation, a spiritual meditation. That's the Monday theme. It's Monday meditation on an ancient text. Tuesdays are life lessons, stories from my past, sometimes from my childhood, sometimes all different points in my life. Wednesdays are topical. I have a long list of topics that I am chomping at the bit to cover, but because it's only once a week, I can only do one a week. Sometimes I'll incorporate them into the other themes and the other shows, the other days of the week. Thursday is Hollywood Theme Thursday. That's when I talk specifically about working in Hollywood, sometimes the project I'm working on or other projects that I've worked on, just to give a little insight into what that world is really like. And then Fridays, as I've already mentioned, is Freeform Friday. I just hit record and start talking. Sometimes I read emails if I get them. At this point, this is the 8th week that I've been doing this consistently, and I have only sent, there's only one person who knows how to find this at this point. As of the date of this recording, I have one listener. I have an audience of one. It's my mom, and she's enjoying it and emailing me, and so she has exclusive access to Freeform Friday until other people discover this podcast and start emailing. So far, she has anything I've been reading in emails is from her. Love you, Mom. And without further ado, let me launch into a topic that is highly controversial, and I expect an email from Mom, and I expect emails from other people about this, but there's, because of the spiritual overtones to this show, I'm going to venture into some controversial territory, and I already have. If you've listened to any of my show so far, I imagine I've probably piqued some curiosity and maybe struck a few chords that people would disagree with, or I'm just being honest to how I see things, and I want to be corrected if I'm wrong. I even had an episode called I Am Wrong, so I know I am wrong about any number of things, but I also believe that I am right about any number of things, and I wouldn't speak them forth if I didn't think I was right about much of it. If I'm unsure, hopefully I'm being honest about everything as much as possible, and if what I say resonates as true, then to a larger audience or to others, then that's further evidence that maybe I'm on the right track. And so I again encourage you to email me at MyDailyWalk@thiswaytv.com to fact check me on anything, to propose an alternate theory to something, or to confirm confirmation of something I've said in any of the shows. So that verse, I didn't actually know where it was. I just knew it was there, and so I looked it up. Revelation 11:1, measure the temple. So I do expect at some point maybe I will have an audience, and if that audience grows, I expect there will be fans or listeners who would not consider themselves maybe not spiritual at all. Maybe some atheists will stumble across this and find it interesting for some reason, or at the very least some who are agnostic about their religious beliefs. And that's, I think, the most honest point of view. If you haven't bought into a particular theology, then agnosticism is really the only honest self-assessment that people can make. People that claim to be atheists, it's really a self-refuting concept. Again, hear me out. To be an atheist, again, I think is actually impossible. What does atheism assert? I'm sure you can boil it down to different brands or versions of atheism, but essentially an atheist declares there is no God. That's a dogmatic assertion. Unfortunately, to make such an assertion, you yourself would have to be all-knowing. To say there is no God is to say I've explored the entire depths of knowledge. I know all of history. I know all of science. I know. To make such a dogmatic assertion essentially is impossible. I mean, it's like, this is not a sentence, right? It's a self-refuting statement. Of course it's a sentence, and saying there is no God is like, you can't even make the statement. So that's why I say agnosticism is the honest assessment of those who've not ascribed to a particular religious worldview. So, sorry, I was getting a phone call in the middle of this. Hopefully I don't have to pause it. I responded, please text me. That's the first time I've ever received a phone call on my recording device. Let's see. All right, now I have to pause. Okay, I'm back. I did have to pause there and go attend to something, and that's the first time that's ever happened on my daily walk. So I'm back. Where was I? Well, let's just jump in. I was praising the honesty of the agnostics, I think. Maybe that's where I left off. But I know I broach some controversial subjects. I've already broached controversial subjects. There's controversy inside and outside of different worldviews. And so if any of my listeners don't ascribe to any particular religion, this topic that I'm about to launch into is kind of an in-house debate among Christian theologians, those who ascribe to any number of the denominations that would fall under the umbrella of Christian, whether it's Catholic, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Methodist, Baptist, Assemblies of God, Church of Christ, just the Episcopalian, the list goes on and on. There's just all these different nuances that the different churches ascribe to. So there's debate about any number of issues within Christian theology, and so this one that I'm broaching right now has to do with something called eschatology. Obviously, it's from the book of Revelation, which is this. It's apocalyptic literature. The language used is. Imagine trying to describe something in the future when there are events and scenarios that there aren't even words for yet. That's kind of how it's like. You see things happening on a grand scale in a vision. Like that's Revelation purports to be a vision of a revelation of Jesus Christ directly to his disciple John, after the crucifixion, after the resurrection, after the ascension. And so John has this special encounter where the risen Christ is revealing to him something that's going to happen in the future. And that's where so many different stories diverge. Like, what is he saying? Is this something that was about to happen to John and all the believers in the 7 churches and etc.? Or was it something going to happen to all of humanity at some point? And it really hinges upon, in my personal theological journey, I have ascribed to quite a variety of eschatological points of view. When I started my studies or my research into the teachings, I first encountered one called pre-tribulation rapture. In a nutshell, it means that there's a tribulation coming, and that Revelation is a prediction of that tribulation, that it's coming, and that everybody who is a believer in Christ is going to be raptured prior to those events. And that's I mean, I was new to the theology, to the teaching, so that's the only thing I heard. I assume that was the way, and some of you listening likely ascribe to that point of view. I'm not here to debunk any of the points of view. I'm here to elucidate for the uninitiated that there's a lot of disagreement. Like I said, it's an in-house debate. There's a lot of disagreement about what is yet to come for the human race on the planet. And pre-tribulation rapture is the first explanation, and then there's something called mid-tribulation rapture. In other words, this tribulation period is taught to be a 7-year period, and that there was a midpoint, like 3.5 years in, those who believe would be raptured off the planet, and before the rest of the tribulation occurs. That's called mid-tribulation rapture. I think I ascribed to that at some point briefly, and then I learned something called post-tribulation rapture, which, what convinced me, again in a nutshell, what convinced me of that point of view was a guy who taught about the Exodus, how post-tribulation rapture is self-explanatory. the rapture, instead of pre-trib, before the tribulation, or mid-trib, it happens at the end of the 7-year tribulation. So that's the teaching there. And this guy taught about, he used the Israelites in the book of Exodus and their exodus and the deliverance from Egypt as a template for what the end would be like, and saying that those 10 plagues that came upon Egypt affected the Israelites as well, yet God protected them within Egypt. Even though they were affected, if they did certain things, they were preserved and protected. They put the blood on their doorposts, that the plagues didn't directly affect them, but it certainly affected their neighbors and the people around them. And so it's like, oh, if God can protect you even in the midst of tribulation. So that's when I began to ascribe to something called post-tribulation. Then I kind of stepped back and said, well, everybody seems to have a scriptural support for their point of view. I don't know. I don't know if any of these are even accurate. But so I became what I would say I was pan-trib. I said, well, it's all going to pan out in the end. I just believe the teaching, one of the non-negotiables is the return of Christ, the teaching. So there's all these different nuances and details of what could happen before that event, the return of Christ, but the return of Christ is the non-negotiable. That's the essential. That's what the Bible teaches, that there is a return coming and that something's going to lead up to that. So I became, it's all going to pan out in the end, pan-trib. And then I came across teachings that the tribulation is not even referring to something in the future, but something in the past. And this is kind of where this particular verse comes into play. Before I let's see how much time I have left. All right, we're good. So essentially, eschatology, study of last things, I think is the literal definition. Study of last things according to Christian theology or text. I guess every worldview has an eschatology, but for this discussion, I believe eschatology generally refers to just Christian eschatology or biblical eschatology, Judeo-Christian end times, what that means. So there's 2 points of view, essentially. I just gave you several, but there's a couple general categories. There's the point of view that the book of Revelation, the majority of it, and other texts like it in the Bible, whether it's Daniel or Matthew 24 or 2 Thessalonians, I don't know all the texts, but there's a bunch of apocalyptic literature that are prophetic or talking about things to come. And generally, Revelation, let's just stick with that, is seen as something that either is still going to happen, or it was referring to something that the reader and the writer, it was in the future for them, and then it came to pass, so it would be in the past for us. So those are the 2 general kind of overarching categories of eschatology. It's futurism. In other words, for us, the majority of these things have yet to happen, or maybe they're happening now or unfolding. That the majority of Revelation or the apocalyptic descriptions are about things that are still in our future. That's futurism. And then the other view is preterism or partial preterism. Again, even in preterism, there's different, just like there was pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib, amillennial, premillennialism. There's all these different. So preterism has its own. There's hyper-preterism, partial preterism, but generally preterism maintains that John was getting a glimpse from Jesus about things that were about to happen in his generation, that he was about to see some cataclysmic thing happen, and this is a warning that you write these things down and send it out. Make sure this gets distributed among the churches, and so that the people are forewarned. So it was more of a short-term prophecy. So futurism is long-term. That's been thousands of years since it was prophesied, and it still hasn't come to pass. Preterism says it's short-term, that it was like imminent. These things are about to occur. Get ready. And then they happened, and then now the majority of those things are in the past. And I think I don't know what it is, but even the return of Jesus by some preterists, one branch of preterism says even the return of Jesus didn't mean a literal bodily return, and so it already happened. And so the way that this particular passage factors into that debate is really why I picked this verse, because it's fascinating to me. I think it could be kind of a linchpin verse as to which of those two interpretations are more accurate. I have been spending a lot of time with historians working on the project I'm working on, and I keep pursuing truth. Like, it's a word I use. They don't like that word. Historians don't like that word. But all I mean by it is actual, most likely, what was probably happened. I want to know what really happened. I want to know the truth, and that's the context. And when you study ancient documents, no matter how old, when you study documents from the past, you have to study the context. Who was writing? What were the circumstances? What were the cultural circumstances? And who was that person writing to? Those are all critical to interpreting what was meant. It's a counter to postmodernism. Postmodernism says there is no such thing as truth. In fact, there is no such thing as an accurate account of history. You can interpret things any way you want, and there is no such thing as meaning. And talk about self-refuting. But some things can be known, can be determined, can be verified. Courts, a justice system wouldn't exist if witness testimony and circumstantial evidence, and if interpreting documents and writings and intentions of the authors, if those things cannot be determined, then there is no legal system. So when one of the arguments for one of these points of view hinges upon this verse. It's called an internal evidence. In other words, there's external evidences would be if somebody else, some other writer, commented on John's writing, or there was a contemporary scenario that we know about that could verify outside of the writings of the Bible. That's called an external evidence, an external source. But internal evidence would be what was stated within the source material, which we're talking about, the book of Revelation. So putting ourselves in John's shoes is critical to the interpretation. He's having an glorious out-of-body experience. He's seeing the risen Christ, or he's seeing the new body of Christ. That's how it's described. It's like the way he describes visually experiencing this event is clearly, Christ is risen and is like in the Transfiguration story permanently. Like, that's what he's like always now. You'll have to look up the Transfiguration story if you don't know what I'm referring to. Anyway, so here's Jesus telling John, go measure the temple. Now, the argument for the preterist viewpoint says, why would Jesus, the preterist being that Revelation refers to an event that's happened in our past but was still in John's future. The argument is that why would Jesus say to John, go measure the temple, if there was no temple? Very important to note here, in 70 AD, like the year 70, the temple was destroyed. Roman Empire came in to suppress this rebellious faction, this one particular ethnic population that's a part of our vast empire is kind of in revolt or whatever. I don't know all the circumstances that led up to what's called the fall of Jerusalem. In other words, the Romans sent some troops, legions, to essentially wipe the place out, and they did. They destroyed Jerusalem. They leveled it, and the temple, it was actually the second temple, because the temple had been destroyed one time before. This was the second temple. It was leveled, destroyed. And the temple is the center of the Jewish faith. The sacrificial system is the cornerstone. You can't even fulfill your obligations to the Lord if you don't follow the procedures of sacrificing. And so that's what the temple was, and it was leveled, devastated. So, 70 AD. What that means is, if Jesus is saying, go measure the temple, and he means go measure the temple, it would suggest that the book of Revelation was written prior to 70 AD. If there was a physical temple that could be measured. So that makes sense. And so that is an internal support for the preterist point of view. I'm just stating that. That's one of the internal evidences to say this was a prophecy about things that were about to happen, and if there was no temple yet, he couldn't have measured it. Why would Jesus being God and omniscient and all-knowing, knowing if there was no temple, why would he say go measure it? I haven't really researched all the arguments. I just know that one, but there's the arguments against it would be more maybe he was clearly referring to spiritual temple, measure it spiritually. But I mean, the verse says I was given a rod, a measuring stick. Again, if for the futurist interpretation, all of those things have to be symbolic and metaphorical for something else. And I'm sure, and again, I haven't researched it all, but I'm sure there are explanations given by those who adhere to a futurist eschatology. So I know it's like a hornet's nest that I might have just kicked, or a Pandora's box that I've cracked open. But email me and tell me what you think. Call me a heretic. I haven't declared that I'm ascribing to one or the other. This is an educational treatise. It's Theology 101 or Eschatology 101. If you don't know this stuff, then now you do, and good. And if you think one makes sense over the other, great, run with it. Email me. I'm curious to see what the responses are. Another thought I had, in the less than a minute, in the minute and a half left, measure the temple. It's important to understand, for anyone, whether you're a Christian or not, that the temple has always been just a picture of the human body. So God tells Moses, build a temple, outer court, inner court, holy of holies. I'm going to hang out in the holy of holies. That's where you can come. Well, your high priest can come and have communion with me, have fellowship with me. And so it's like so that humans can commune with God. That is the point of the temple. And then in the New Testament writings, the emphasis is, well, that old covenant, that old building to make sacrifices, you don't have to go there anymore, because now Jesus is the sacrifice, like once and for all. So all the sacrificial system was just a picture of something yet to come. And so the Christian teaching is that Jesus fulfilled that, and that the temple now, the Holy of Holies, is actually your heart. And I don't mean the physical organ. It means, what is the heart of something? It's the center of something. And once you bring Christ or the teachings of Christianity into the center of your life, and then God dwells in you. You become the temple, or it's always been the plan anyway. So I just thought I'd tag that on the end here. measure the temple